Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. My guest today is Mr. Mark Zaid, attorney from Washington, D.C. I would say that probably Mark is the most famous lawyer in the world right now. Together with Mark today, we'll talk about January 6th, 2021 assault on Capitol Hill. Thanks for your time, Mark. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me as a guest.
Well, would you like, before we start, to say something about yourself, like something about your background? Because actually, it sounds weird to ask you to introduce yourself because you're so well known that people already know everything. But if you want to tell us something in a nutshell about who you are, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. And, I'm sometimes tired of being a lawyer, so I'm wearing my University of Rochester t-shirt. So if anyone who's watching your YouTube channel is interested in applying to the University of Rochester in New York, I fully recommend it. I love the school. I have been practicing law for 30 years. I say I'm a national security lawyer. I represent spies, spies of the United States, people who work inside the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the U.S. military, usually in cases involving the U.S. government, where they are having issues just as an employment issue, just like anybody else might have with their employer around the world. But I do a lot of international work. In fact, I dealt with the rendition case in Milan a number of years ago with some of the U.S. government officials who were prosecuted in absentia. I handle many cases, and people can see here this artwork that I have up at my office. Those are my cases up on that top place. So the D.B. Cooper skyjacking case, the anthrax vaccination program, the Lincoln assassination, the Kennedy assassination, Princess Diana. I represented Mohammed Al-Fayed, the father of Dodi Al-Fayed, who died with the princess. I do government transparency work and accountability. Sued the government of Libya for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in 1988. These are the type of cases that I do. But I deal a lot with any type of government accountability, whether U.S. government or foreign.
And this that we discussed today is also one of these cases.
Absolutely.
So let's start from the basic. So you filed a claim against Donald Trump for the January 6th assault on Capitol Hill because you're representing a police officer who was killed in the assault. Would you like to tell us something about this?
Sure. So I have been representing several of the U.S. Capitol Police employees who were involved in the January 6th uprising in 2021 of the attempt to subvert and undermine the election certification results. The election obviously happened in November of 20. And in this case, I'm representing the estate of U.S. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick. His former girlfriend is the personal representative of the estate, but the claim is actually on behalf of Officer Sicknick by his estate. It is a claim of wrongful death and some other claims against former President Trump and two individuals who were convicted, pled guilty to assaulting Officer Sicknick on that day with pepper spray, possibly bear spray, depending on which account that you look at. But it's a very similar type of chemical compound. One's obviously stronger than another for a bear versus a human with respect to pepper spray. And we filed this lawsuit earlier this year, January, before the statute of limitations ran, which was 2 years for wrongful death claims. And we are now in the process of what's called briefing the issue. Former President Trump has filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. That was filed about a week and a half ago, and we are in the process of filing a response, which I believe is due towards the end of this month of April 2023.
Well, let's set the point straight about what sparked this. Was the election stolen? Were votes thrown in the trash bin, sent to Canada, or was everything regular?
No, there was no stolen election. Now, there are always election irregularities throughout the United States from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Problems do happen, but there was certainly no widespread issue in any particular jurisdiction that impacted any of the votes. There have been numerous investigations done at multiple levels of the U.S. government, from the littlest, city officials up through the federal government. And without a doubt, and of all, I want to say there were like 61 or so, certainly 6 lawsuits filed by Trump supporters to say the election was stolen. And every single one of them failed, other than one succeeded on a technicality, but it had no impact whatsoever on the votes.
Well, getting back to the assault on Capitol Hill, was Trump directly responsible for provoking this, or was he guilty of not stopping this, or not involved at all, in your opinion?
So a little bit of all the above. I don't think anyone is of the opinion that Trump helped plan directly with individuals such as the Proud Boys, a right-wing militia group of which their members are still, some of which are still ongoing criminal trials. Others have been already convicted. The campaign, the Trump campaign, helped, of course, to set up the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th. That was all planned in advance. There were lots of promotions, emails, fundraising efforts where they were antagonizing, encouraging, promoting, inciting people to come to Washington, D.C., ostensibly to lawfully protest, right? There's no issues with lawful protests. There's no issues with the speeches that were given that day as far as people attending the speeches. But at the speech, President Trump then, in his campaign capacity, made comments about unplanned, unscripted, walk down to the Capitol, people. I'm paraphrasing. I don't have the words in front of me, but essentially to encourage people to go to the Capitol, that he was going to go there with them, which of course he did not, in order to persuade the members of Congress and Vice President Pence to stop the certification. Obviously, that had went completely out of hand, and lots of people got caught up in wrongdoing. Others instigated it. And there already have been court decisions, federal court decisions, where multiple judges have directly tied what President Trump said and did to the actions, unlawful actions of that day.
But how can people be so determined to follow the leader to the point of assaulting the Congress? Have these people been brainwashed?
Yeah, I don't have a good explanation for that outside of my expertise as a lawyer. It's a psychiatric or a psychological issue. My political science background in remembering how groupthink works and how mob mentality works. I'm not trying to make a direct comparison here, but there are nice historical comparisons to Germany in the early 1930s as National Socialism started to pick up, of the vast number of good Germans who either went along with or did nothing to stop, thereby allowing the Nazi government to gain further and further power to the point of where it obviously went as it did. That happens in history. There's lots of studies, psychological studies on how that is. And I have no doubt that there were any number of people that day who just got caught up in it, that they never planned on breaking any law. They were just going to vocally protest. But that changes when you start throwing glass bottles at police officers, when you start hitting police officers with sharp flag ornaments, or pipes or poles, when you use pepper spray on officers, when you break windows of the U.S. Capitol, when you enter by trespassing into the U.S. Capitol. It may be the people's house, and anyone, you don't have to be an American, you can go in that house and you can go on tours, but you have to do so within the public hours. You can only go into the public spaces. So, there are laws that govern where anybody can go. and the building was closed on that day. So they trespassed by entering into it, regardless of whether they broke the window or they just followed people in after.
Well, I guess that you've read the report, the final report by the January 6th committee. What do you think of it? Does it answer all the questions, or are there still unanswered points?
It did not answer all the questions. I was actually disappointed with it. It was, I will say, it was political in the sense of, even though obviously there were two members of the Republican Party, even though they weren't there as members from the Republican leadership, but it was appropriately focused on President Trump and his involvement in how January 6th came to be. It was inappropriately absent in addressing what could have been done by U.S. government agencies to stop, to learn of the planning in advance, and then to stop the actual implementation. That unfortunately was not there as much as it should have been. What did the Department of Homeland Security know in advance? Where was the information disseminated? What was the role of the military? How was the coordination supposed to be between the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Army or the D.C. National Guard? Who had authority to call them out? What protocols needed to happen to provide additional shields and helmets and weapons to the Capitol Police, as well as the Metropolitan D.C. Police? This was all pretty much absent from the final report. And so what was issued was a helpful, necessary report. What was omitted was the problem.
You also called for the removal of a committee member because of a retaliation case against a whistleblower. Would you like to tell us something about this case?
Yeah, so two staff members, but senior staff members. The executive director of the January 6th committee was a man named David Buckley. And Buckley used to be the inspector general at the Central Intelligence Agency. And I represented a former member of that office who filed a whistleblower complaint against Buckley and others in his office, superiors, leadership within the office. And the Department of Homeland Security was given the investigation to look into whether there was unlawful retaliation. And in September of 2019, issued a report that concluded David Buckley, as the CIA Inspector General, unlawfully retaliated against a lawful whistleblower. Name is Andrew Buckeye. He's a colleague, friend, client of mine. Andrew and I co-represented the intelligence community whistleblower in the first Trump impeachment. Andrew wrote the CIA rules about lawful whistleblowing and implementing the Obama administration's whistleblowing protections for the national security community. So to have a whistleblower retaliator as the head executive director of this committee, where we were bringing whistleblowers to, I represented two of the four Capitol police officers, actually the only Capitol police officers who were whistleblowers and testified at the first open hearing of the January 6th committee. So that was incredibly problematic. To top it all off, there was another individual named Joseph Maher, M-A-H-E-R, or Mayer, depending on how you want to pronounce it. He was a senior Department of Homeland Security official who was detailed over to the January 6th committee. Now, he was put there because of Liz Cheney, the ranking Republican on the committee. Cheney's husband used to be, or was, the first general counsel at the Department of Homeland Security when that agency was created in the early 2000s during the second Bush administration, George W. Bush administration. And he was a lawyer in the office who worked with Cheney's husband. So he was detailed over to this committee. The problem with that was, one, I represented the former acting undersecretary of intelligence at the Department of Homeland Security, who had been replaced by Mayer. And then we had whistleblower allegations against him. Push that aside because those whistleblower allegations were never substantiated. They were dropped. We reached a resolution. They weren't proven. They weren't disproven. But because Mayer took over from my client in the summer of 2020, he was the individual in charge of the intelligence gathering apparatus of the Department of Homeland Security on January 6th, 2021. The apparatus that failed. So how do you have a congressional committee that investigates the role of intelligence in whether or not DHS and other federal agencies missed opportunities to identify the threat and then missed opportunities to stop the threat once identified, yet have the individual responsible for that failure, at least in part by his virtue of his position, on the investigative staff? And we raised, a lot of public concern about it. There was a lot of news stories about both of these cases I just mentioned. And this is where politics won out because both of these gentlemen remained in their positions. And in fact, if you read the final report of the committee, as soon as I got it, I did a word search for Joseph Mayer to see where he was mentioned. And the first instance was listing him as like the number 3 staffer on the committee. And then I think once elsewhere as having received a request by the committee in the very, very beginning before he was assigned to ensure that no documents were destroyed by DHS. No discussion whatsoever as to what I mentioned before about what was omitted in this report. No discussion as to his role in failing to ensure DHS did its job. Big, big problem. And that, I think, will forever be a stain on the excellent work that the committee otherwise did.
Well, still speaking about this investigation, this was so big that the whole world was expecting a 9/11 style commission, but that didn't happen. Do you know why?
Sure. And part of the reason why these omissions happened was because of the fact that in the 2020 elections, the 22, I can't even keep track of the dates. The November 2022 midterm elections, the Democrats lost the House of Representatives. That meant this committee had a short shelf life and was going to go out of business by the first week of January 2023 because the Republicans would take over and the committee would be dissolved, which is what exactly happened. So they had to rush or at least move on a more expedited basis. The bigger problem was the Republicans as a group did not cooperate. At first, McCarthy, who was the ranking member, the position, the highest ranking Republican in a democratically controlled Congress, he appointed a number of people who the Democrats refused to sit, which is their prerogative. And in response, opposition, retaliation, the Republicans withdrew all support. So you only ended up with Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, 2 moderate Republicans, which is kind of ironic to say that because that is not what Liz Cheney was viewed at prior to the years before, but absolutely became because the rest of the party somewhat shifted more to the right. So they stayed on. So in that sense, it was bipartisan. But the reality was it wasn't, as the 9/11 Commission was, a truly bipartisan effort by both sides to examine what events led up to, in that case, 9/11 versus what led up to January 6th. And that's unfortunate.
Of course, it was, yes. And it was highly political.
Absolutely.
Do you think Russia had a role in backing this insurrection, maybe by spreading false information, false propaganda, or something like that?
Obviously there are allegations about that, concerns about that, reporting about that. I think what's safe to say, and there's no surprise of it, is that Russia does what it can to stoke tension within the United States and elsewhere of countries that are adversarial to it, to exploit tensions that already exist. And it's done that for decades and decades and decades. So nothing new there. What did they have a role in planning January 6th, anything of the sort? No, I mean, look, the Republican Party, the Trump campaign planned the events of January 6th, not necessarily that the insurrection attempt and the criminal activity was designed to happen. But, if you look behind the scenes as to what was being stoked online on entities or platforms like Twitter and 4chan, there's no doubt that there were bots and fraudulent accounts of people pushing certain narratives. Whether or not those were Russian, that is certainly a strong suspicion, but I don't directly have any evidence of that. So I can only go as far as saying that, that would be consistent with Russian behavior among other countries and their intelligence agencies as to the type of disinformation or information intelligence campaigns that they would undertake against their adversaries.
And what is, in your opinion, the role of conspiracy theories such as the QAnon or something like that in pushing these people to do what they did?
Oh, there's no doubt that QAnon played a significant role, and I have represented a man named Ezra Cohen, who was a senior Trump government official at the National Security Council, and then on January 6th was the acting Undersecretary of Intelligence and Security at the Department of Defense, and he was to thousands and thousands of people the head of QAnon. Now, he wasn't the head of QAnon. And I encourage your viewers to go just Google it. You'll find a really good Politico article interviewing Ezra in early 2021, as I recall, talking about this once he was out of the administration, because somebody was impersonating him on the right-wing account. Well, actually, at one point on Twitter, but then on 4chan, Truth Social, Trump's social media site, and elsewhere, pretending to be him and stoking the fires of the conspiracy theories. And you can see amidst the crowd at January 6th at the Capitol, people are wearing QAnon t-shirts. People are carrying QAnon signs. So those conspiracy theories, unfortunately, in a very significant way, fueled the conspiratorial paranoia that led to people believing the false assertions that the election was stolen.
Can something of the sort happen again? Can it end up in a coup?
Yes. I have grave concerns that this can happen again. I do not think this is necessarily a one-off. I certainly hope it will not happen again. A coup... The term coup can be so easily bandied about, right? I mean, I took a lot of flack for using the word in a tweet back in January of 2017 when I was representing the Whistleblower in 2019. People found this one-off tweet that I made at the middle of the night without even thinking, which was referring to the acting Attorney General Sally Yates being fired by President Trump, appropriately being fired. No issue with the firing. She refused to implement some of the immigration policies and laws that he wanted, and she stood up to him. To me, that was illustrative of a coup. It wasn't an attempt to take over the government. It was an attempt to stand up to the government and say, no, this is not the way we're going to do things. And as a result, she got fired. Totally proper. I wasn't referring to an active military coup, an assassination attempt like we saw in 1943, I believe, against Adolf Hitler, or some coup in some country that that many countries have had over the centuries. That's not what we're talking about. And people can reasonably debate what January 6th was. Like, what would have the ultimate outcome actually have been? I mean, we realistically thinking that this group of people, which were numbering in the thousands, could somehow have done something more than simply disrupt the certification, right? It wasn't like they're going to take over the Capitol and start running the government or anything like that, right? They didn't have, they had weapons there. I mean, there were weapons found. Thank God there weren't weapons in the sense of guns or knives used against the officers, but people had them. There were weapons confiscated, and obviously pepper spray is a weapon. A fire extinguisher thrown at a police officer is a weapon and can do grave damage to people. But I am very concerned that we're just in a lull right now, sort of the calm before the storm, because the tension that led to January 6th is still there beneath the surface and could absolutely arise again. And it just depends on, really, it's going to depend on where the leadership goes in the U.S. government, both leadership by way of politics, but leadership by way of the media and reporters or other speakers who are activists and how they portray certain things. So I do not think the United States is out of the woods yet, as we say in an English saying. But it's hard to say how close we are to damaging democracy. Do I think democracy is about to fall? No. Hey, eventually the Roman Empire fell. As you know full well, the Roman Empire fell, right? It can only last so long. And the United States democracy has been around for almost 250 years. Historically speaking, that's pretty damn good. That's a really good run. How long it will last, I do not know. I imagine certainly within our lifetime, it should continue to stay. But each of these incidents, events like January 6th, erode the fabric of democracy and obviously eats away at it. And eventually it depends how much damage is done.
I would like to add a bit, like if in democracy we start considering, as is happening pretty much everywhere, our political opponents as either stupid or illegitimate, then that makes violence acceptable to overthrow them. I don't know what you think about this. Is also this part of the problem?
No, it can absolutely be part of the problem. I mean, part of it is the degree of professionalism has eroded. The sort of like the gentleman, and I use that not in a gender-based term, but the notion of being ethically proper and having proper etiquette. I mean, look, again, just kind of looking at the origins of National Socialism in Germany, it came from lawful government, right? I mean, Hitler came into power with Hindenburg properly, lawfully. It was a coalition government, and then it ended up going where it went. The Nuremberg laws in 1935 were properly enacted by the German government, even though we would view them, as we should, with incredible disdain, discomfort, disgust. Laws in the United States, back the Jim Crow laws, slavery, in our Constitution, but these were all laws properly enacted by governments, even though they reflect now, at least, contrary to democratic, ethical, moral, human principles as to how we view each other. But it doesn't take much, as we've seen in both of our countries and in other allies, doesn't take much for a slippery slope to kind of devolve back to almost like cavemen type mentalities. So it's sad, but true.
Well, Mark, many thanks for your time again. I think that you gave us a very good and useful explanation about what happened on that day, hoping that it never happens again.
I appreciate the opportunity. And, the lesson to be learned, it's not just what we have in the United States to be wary of and be cautious of and observe, but in countries like Italy and across Europe, especially where governments are going to one ideological extreme or the other, whether it's left or right. We need to be very careful, because I think the vast majority of us in the world would be considered moderate, right? We're maybe a little left or a little bit right. The minorities are on the extreme left and right, and that's where the danger comes, because the extremists on both sides act contrary to the interests of the other side. And for those of us who want to be in the moderate majority, we want to respect people on both sides and protect fundamental human rights. So it's really important to have these kind of conversations, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm the one who should be thankful, and I totally agree with what you just said. Thanks everybody for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.